Welcome back to the Grand Hotel as we continue our conversation surrounding this year's Mackinac Policy Conference. Happy once again to sit down with Jerry Norcia, the CEO of DTE. Jerry, there is so much talk here about electrification and the move to make sure Michigan is a leader in that space. You must feel like one of the dames of the ball here.
It is really, Devin, an exciting time in our industry. It's really transformative, both from an electrification perspective, the way we're delivering the power to our customers, and the advent of EVs. I mean, we're attaching about 1,000 EVs a month now, and that's significantly up from
1,000 a month.
Yeah, significantly up for 2 or 3 years ago, where it was maybe 100, 200 a month. So we're seeing the activity increase, and we expect it to ramp up as new products are introduced. So exciting time, right? And then the way we generate power too, where we're making power cleaner and more efficient. That's also a pretty transformative period, and we're not alone in this. The whole country, the whole industry in the country is going through this transformation.
Every time, everybody who watches my program knows I'm an avowed EV aficionado and love my electric vehicle. I know they're not for everyone yet, but when I talk about them, I almost always can count on a few emails, phone calls, letters from people who think that our system is not ready. It's not that consumers aren't ready, it's people that want to say that our system is not ready for this mass conversion to electric. And I mean the grid,
yes,
of course, as well as the charging system.
So
what do you say?
On the grid itself, we've seen this coming, as well as we know the weather's been getting worse. And so in the last 5 years, we've invested $5.5 billion in the grid, which is 2 times the amount we invested in the prior 5 years. When we look forward 5 years, we're going to invest $9 billion in our grid. And it's really for 2 reasons. One, to make it more resilient to these more frequent weather events that we're having. But secondly, anticipation of this extraordinary EV demand. So we'll be ready. And we're timing it. We're ahead of it. So our customers are funding some of that preparation to accelerate the journey towards being ready for EVs. But once the EVs come, that'll be a significant downward pressure on electricity prices. And as a matter of fact, if you have your EV, Devin, I'd suggest you take us up on our 11 p.m. to 9 a.m. rate, which is 80 cents a gallon. That's an incredible price.
Which you can time your vehicle to charge.
Yeah, all you can do with your app.
The last time you and I spoke, we were in the command center.
Yes.
It was following the really bad blackouts that we had during the ice storm of this past winter, and you were at the time talking about trying to make the case really to Michiganders that we've got to invest in the grid. And yet we know that we already pay a lot more for electricity than a lot of other states around us. And so the case that you're trying to make that we need to pay pay more for less, that we're already not getting what we need to for our money. How do you answer that criticism?
Well, if you look at the average bill of a residential customer in Michigan, it's below the national average. And now the rates are a little higher than the national average, but what customers actually pay on their bills because of throughput in the state of Michigan is actually lower than the national average. So the case that I make is we need to prepare for this transformation where weather is worsening, our system is aging, and so we're in a place where a good portion of our system, about 1/3 of our system, is anywhere from 50 to 70 years old, and it needs to be replaced and automated. And it's really an investment in the future prosperity of Michigan. We need to have a reliable grid and a resilient grid. And it may take some investment up front, and there may be modest pressure on bills. We're trying to control that to 2 or 3% a year. And I think that'll be a great investment for the state for another 3 or 4 generations. Once we make that investment, it's good for 70 to 80 years.
I want to let you respond to a criticism that has been really more anecdotal than anything that I've ever seen put in paper. But that we have missed out on big projects like the Ford projects that went to Kentucky and Tennessee because our electric rates are too high.
Well, that's I would say that's bogus. That's my reaction.
I mean, you've heard this.
Yeah, I've heard it. And the reaction is we've got a rate that we've put in front of other large industrial customers, like General Motors, for example, is building a big battery plant in Orion. We've got one of the best offers on the table in the industry in the country. We could compete with anybody in the country, depending on the load characteristics of the new project, which this is a high demand, high load factor. In other words, it runs 24/7. We can compete with anybody, and we have, and we've attracted multiple battery plants to our state because of that.
back to the blackouts, and I go back to conversations that I had up here on Mackinac more than 20 years ago with Tony Early.
Yes.
And then Jerry Anderson.
Yes.
And my question was always the same about, aren't we better off burying the lines? And for years, the answer I got is, it's such an enormous expense. You can't imagine what it would take, to try and bury every line. Now, you talk a little bit more about burying lines.
Well, 1/3 of our system is already underground, so anything that was built after the late 60s, early 70s, we've buried. So all new subdivisions, all new developments have gone underground. About 2/3 of our system is above ground. Of that, so let's split the system into thirds. About 15,000 miles of our grid, which is 1/3 of our grid, is above ground and quite old, and it's a lower voltage. And so you have weaker construction, thinner wires, smaller poles, smaller cross arms, all the things that create resiliency when it's above ground. And that system needs to be replaced for two reasons. One is because it's quite old, and secondly, it won't carry the EV demand long term. It will for the next 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So
I guess I wasn't asking Jerry Anderson about EV demand.
Right.
20 years
that
ago,
was something.
right?
The last two CEOs were faced with different circumstances. They
Sure.
weren't faced with once in a generation storms becoming once every 1 to 3 years. They weren't faced with the advent of significant demand growth from EVs, which this much older system can't handle over the long term. It'll carry us for the next 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So we're thinking 10 years, 20 years out as this demand starts to ramp in a fundamental way. But while we do that and replace that 15,000 miles, we got to do everything we can to put as much of this underground as we can. And do it in an economic way. So we're going to start with a pilot in Detroit. I've talked to the mayor of Detroit, Mayor Duggan, and he's very excited to try the first 5 miles in Detroit. And we'll do 5 miles, then we'll do 10 miles, then we'll do 20 miles, and then we'll ramp as much as possible and see how much of this we can put underground. The technology's changed on how you bury underground cable. When we're replacing 200 miles of gas pipe in Michigan right now, we're using this boring technology where you can drill 10, 15 feet underground, and it's much more economic than opening up streets and opening up front yards.
Right.
So we have the advent of new technology. We've got a significant need, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to replace 15,000 miles of our grid, 1/3 of our grid. And we're going to do everything we can to put as much of it underground as possible. And once it goes underground, it won't be subject to the climate conditions that we're experiencing.
So the technology is changing on both sides of it, what you're putting in the ground and how you get it in the ground.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yes.
The other thing that we've always had worries over, nobody wants to live too close to a power station. We all worry about what kind of health factors there might be with too much electricity, too many electrons bouncing around off of us. What is the state right now of the safety of? Is there a difference, I guess, then, between the safety of putting it up in the air and putting it in the ground as far as our personal health?
Well, it's never been proven that there's a personal health issue with, and it's really mostly about transmission lines, the big towers, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the lower voltage systems, that run through your backyards and run down streets. So I've not heard that there's
the
any
big
health.
Transmission systems have to stay what they are.
Yes, I mean they're 60, 70 feet, 80 feet in the air, and they're the large transmission systems, and they have a lot of clearance.
Yeah.
Those are owned by ITC, and they do a nice job of keeping those right-of-ways very clear of any sort of structures or population. So I don't feel that those are a danger either.
Yeah.
But ours are certainly much lower voltage and not known to cause any health risk.
Well, it's another question that I get all the time about EVs. How healthy can it be for me to sit constantly on top of a battery?
Well, again, I'm not a medical scientist, but what I would say is that the emission reductions that we experience as a society from going from gasoline-powered engines to battery-powered engines, the fundamental reduction in air pollution is massive. And as we convert our generation fleet, which is going to power all of those EVs, to solar, wind, batteries, and clean-burning natural gas, and perhaps with carbon capture someday, the amount of emissions are going to be negligible from how we produce the power as well.
The U.S. in general, and Michigan specifically, is really trying to figure out its relationship with China. And this becomes pretty acute when we start talking about electrification. They are electrifying much more quickly than we are with cars. They've controlled a lot of the heavy metals market that is required for us to create the batteries here. And I'm really, and in fact, you showed me in the control center how many cyber threats are coming in from China on a daily basis.
Yes.
I'm really curious on your take on China.
Well, look I know the American government has done a wonderful job of incenting onshoring of industry back to America, and I'm a huge supporter of that. Let's create the jobs in America.
Yeah.
Let's put our young people to work. Let's create a future for our young people so that they can have jobs in these great industries. So I'm very supportive of that, and I think that's a fundamental strategy shift that we saw here in the last little while.
Yeah.
And we're actually seeing it. The amount of economic development and onshoring of manufacturing facilities that we're seeing just in Michigan is the most I've ever seen in 20 years, where we're getting constant requests to locate new manufacturing assets in the state of Michigan to support the EV transformation. But also...
you are an interesting bellwether of economic indicators then on that front, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing that, and it's quite exciting. And I know that the autos are looking for different supply chains. I mean, they're looking at mining operations in the United States that could produce some of the metals that we need. We're looking at different types of metals that could create batteries. So I think the amount of innovation that will happen in the automotive industry in the next little while to deal with some of the supply chain concerns from non-friendly countries, I think the innovation is going to be extraordinary. So I'm confident that that'll get solved. As far as the cyber attacks, thousands of attacks every day from countries that you would recognize, China, Russia.
Every day.
Every day that I see coming through our cyber control center. And you got a chance to see that.
Yeah.
And we've got a crackerjack team that cooperates with every utility in real time across America, but also the Department of Defense, the FBI, Homeland Security. We're in constant communications, warding off those attacks, but also creating defense in depth. And we've been very successful.
It's become such a critical part. I mean,
It is.
Security's always been a part of what you do.
Very critical.
But pretty wild
Yes.
right now. Chair Norris, it's always really good to
Thank
talk
you,
to you.
Devin.
I got to talk
Pleasure.
to you all day. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.